Hi guys, this is Professor Faden from Kingsborough, CUNY. I'm here to make a little video of a talk I was going to give this month for Women's History Month. Every March, as you may know, and by the way, this talk is mostly sort of for our students. The talk I was going to give, the vast majority of people who were going to be present were Kingsborough students, and so the talk is really for students and for anyone who's interested in the topic. So I'm here to talk to you about a book that I have coming out in a few months. It's a book coming out with a publisher called Routledge, and it's about a book. So it's one book about one book. But it is a book on the novel called Beloved by Toni Morrison. I want to just say a warm hello to my students, and I wanted to say hello also to Frances Robinson, who is the director of the Women's Center, and she's my friend. At Kingsborough, Frances does so much work, hard work every year, to put together a brilliant lineup of events for Women's History Month. And of course, with everything that's happening, Frances had to cancel all those events, and so that's sad. And so I wanted to make the video so that we have something, right, that isn't about the virus, is about school stuff and is schoolish, and is also there kind of on the books for Women's History Month for this year. First, I'm going to talk about the novel Beloved, and very first thing I'm going to talk about is the historical background that is important to the novel Beloved, which is a historical novel and not just a fictional story. It's part fiction, part history. And then I'm going to talk about the novel itself, what I say about the novel and how I interpret the novel, and how I arrived at my interpretation. And then I'm going to explain why it's important. And that is looking at American history a little bit. So really our territory, in this talk is America. We're not talking about the whole world, things that have happened here, things that are happening here. And we're talking about this novel, which is about American history and written by an American author. Toni Morrison died sadly last year. She was born in 1931, so she was 88 years of age when she passed away, when she transitioned. And she was, to my mind, very definitely the most important writer of our time. She wrote 11 novels. She was a philosopher. She was a publisher and editor. She was a teacher like me, but at Princeton University. She was also in a very important leadership role at Princeton. She was a cultural critic. She gave many speeches. Some of her speeches are published as well in book form or essay form, and so you can look her up. I'm going to put links and stuff in the description below so that you have quick access to information, some of the information I'm going to talk about. So let's start first with some stuff about the novel Beloved and some of the historical backgrounds. Here's one of the editions of the novel. This is the movie tie-in edition, and you see this picture here on the cover, which is a still from the film. And that is the character the novel is named for. So there's a character in the novel called Beloved, and there she is, perched against a tree at a certain pivotal moment in the story, which I'm going to talk about. So the first thing I want to say is there's a history to this novel. When an artist like Toni Morrison takes some historical information. A lot of art, a lot of novels, a lot of films are historical. So they're partly invention and partly coming from factual histories that actually happened. This is one of those types of books. So it's history and it's also fiction. And that's a really important sort of space, that we need to study, right? That we do study, which is the space of, when an artist takes something real, something from actual history, and then brings it into their art, therefore turning history into art. Then when that happens, it's like everything becomes symbolic, and what the artist is often doing is sort of taking the historical situation, details, circumstances, and making a meaning out of it, which often when we read, say, a history textbook, or we read a historical thing in, say, a newspaper, it isn't really a meaning isn't really being made out of it. It's just the reporting of information, right? That's what journalism often is. That's what a history textbook often is. It's reportage. It's information. An artist takes information and turns it, spins it, right? Crafts it into art, which works on a whole different level. Art isn't just stuff we know in our head, dates, people's names. Art is something that speaks to us on a deeper level, on sort of a gut level, on the level of emotion first, very often. That's really powerful. That's a really powerful way of learning, right? Learning through feeling first, or what some people would call affect, right? Learning that way first. And this has really been something that from way back, way far back in history, right? The classical era, and beyond the classical era, this has been sort of talked about, and it's been, for people like me, I'm a literature professor and I teach literature, and I publish books like the book I'm publishing on Morrison's Beloved, and and so it's one of the things that we sort of think about, is the role of emotion in terms of what we learn and how we learn and how do we learn best and what are the things that really stick with us and how does that happen. Art is a form of representation, but it's different from a history that is representing history. The art is speaking to us about what does it mean, what are the implications, what are we, what are the questions about this history, this moment, this circumstance, which is real. And so that's what Toni Morrison's novel Beloved does. The novel is based on a woman called Margaret Garner, and this is Women's History Month. So we're thinking about women, we're celebrating women, we're celebrating Toni Morrison, we're honoring and remembering her in this talk and in my book, and then the same so with this a historical figure by the name of Margaret Garner. Margaret was a slave. She was African American. She was born a slave. She was a slave on a plantation in Kentucky. And she lived on the plantation with her husband, Robert, and her 4 children. And at a certain point, they got together with a bunch of slaves on other sort of nearby plantations and escaped. So there was a whole group of 17 of them that escaped. And the escape was initially successful. They traveled through the Underground Railroad, got to the state line of Kentucky and Ohio, crossed over the state line into Ohio, got to a safe house. The safe house is in the Underground Railroad as part of the way that whole system was trying to keep escaped slaves free and give them their lives back. The safe houses were houses of protection, and where escapees would be protected and hidden, and sort of similar to during the Holocaust in World War II. Slavery was a horrible thing that happened in history. Holocaust was a horrible thing that happened in history, and in these times, thank heavens, there are good people too, people who are trying to do good in a time of hate. People were also hidden, like during the Holocaust. Some of you may know the story of Anne Frank, the diary of Anne Frank. So she was kind of in a safe house. So that's what happens. They arrive at the safe house. When they cross the line from Kentucky into Ohio, that actually would have been a lot more meaningful years earlier, before George Washington, who I know you know and have heard of, before George Washington passed what are called the Fugitive Slave Laws. The Fugitive Slave Laws made it so that a slave owner, if the escaped slave crossed the line into a different state, after the passing of the Fugitive Slave Laws, they could cross state lines and continue hunting down the escaped person. And George Washington passed those laws because George Washington, you may or may not know, owned hundreds of slaves. When he got married, his wife came with a dowry including over 100 slaves. A woman by the name of Ona Judge, so here we'll mark her as well. Women's History Month, Ona Judge, slave owned by George Washington and his wife. She was like his wife's maidservant or hand servant, and she escaped from their home when she was, I think, around 15. She eventually, there's a new book I wanted to show you called Never Caught. This is a book about Ona Judge. And so I was very, very happy to see Erica Dunbar, who wrote that book, another scholar, a historian. So now we know about the life of Ona Judge, and we know about her and her escape and all of that. George Washington never caught her, which is why the book is called Never Caught. However, from the moment that she escaped his ownership, he hunted her down for the rest of his life. He never stopped hunting this woman down. He was still hunting for her when he died. And that is sad because he is one of our founding fathers, and for many Americans, right, he stands as a sort of symbol of freedom and of building and creating the homeland of the free. And isn't it ironic and strange that he would be so angry about the escape of this one slave that he passes a whole series of laws so that such slaves can be effectively recaptured, and that applies to everyone who owns slaves, not just him. And that he works so hard and spends so much time, energy, and money to try and get her. Luckily, she was protected. The fact that she was never caught means that she was being protected. So during the Underground Railroad, and, during the time of slavery, people would be moved around from house to house so that they couldn't be caught, right? They would be moved again and moved. And so she was definitely being protected, and she lived, and, had a family, and got her life back, lived her life, right? And so her story is much happier. Margaret Garner, when she and her husband escaped, unfortunately, they were not as fortunate as Ona. They were recaptured almost immediately. They arrived to the safe house. It's owned by a guy called Kite. Kite was a former slave, and now he was free and had this house in Ohio, and he puts the house into the system of the Underground Railroad. So, they're told where to go, and they're told to go to Kite's house, and so they do, and they arrive, and literally hours later, they didn't even have one day of freedom. Who shows up but the owner, his accomplices, the sheriff, the police? They surround the house. And so Margaret and her husband there's a battle that ensues. They fight it out, and they lose. They lose this fight. Now, in the moment of the battle, Margaret, she has, as I said before, she had 4 children that she and Robert were trying to raise together. And in the moment of all this melee, she sees that they have lost this fight, that they're going to be taken back into slavery. And so she takes a butcher knife and she kills her older daughter. And then she tries to kill her other children, but she stopped. So the only one of her children that dies that day is her older daughter. She had 2 sons, 2 daughters. And so she becomes this popular figure that she comes to be called the modern Medea. And you can again Google Medea, Medea, to understand why that becomes her kind of moniker. She is loathed by some. She is loved by others, the abolitionists, the ones who are trying to abolish the institution of slavery, and who eventually do abolish the institution of slavery in and around 1865. The abolitionists use her story as an object lesson in their case, that slavery is wrong and should be abolished, and here is why. And I think that that's part of the reason also why Toni Morrison picks up on the story of Margaret Garner, and then that becomes sort of the jumping off point for her novel Beloved, which is about Margaret Garner and about much more. So we see now this situation, and we might say, well, what did she do that? Why did she do that? That isn't what mothers do, right? And that would be a good question. It's a very hard situation to sort of think through, and it's complicated. But one thing that really complicates this situation is the laws that governed the slave state, which again, you can sort of Google that and start to read about that if you're interested. But the laws that governed the slave state made it so one sort of critical law, and that law, well, there were a lot of critical laws, okay, but the one that was, say, the most damaging, that created the most suffering, was the law that said if you are a chattel slave, not a servant, not in a labor contract, which ends after 5 or 7 years, we call that indentured servitude. A labor contract simply meant you were bound to work for somebody in their home or on their farm or in their business for the period of your labor contract. And sometimes a labor contract was like a penalty for a crime you would have committed. The first sort of rule number 1 of chattel slavery is that you lose your person status under the law. Although you are a person, in fact, obviously, And this was obvious to the people at the time. They knew that the persons who were being enslaved were actual persons. But these laws are created and these customs are created in order to make it so that people who have property, have businesses, can use the system of enslavement to get free labor, right? Or almost free labor. So get their products, the products that they then take to the market and make a profit from, that they can get those products made for free. What could be more ideal than that, right? Having people that you don't have to pay make your products, you sell the products, you make your profit, therefore you make more profit. But this is something that's it's really, really troubling in terms of our history and how foundational this system was, right, in our history. So think about this now. Margaret Garner is being recaptured. She has 4 children who she is trying to protect and trying to keep free. As a chattel slave, she doesn't own herself. She doesn't own her own body because she is not considered a person under the law, right? And so she's considered a thing or an object under the law. She is considered as someone else's property. She therefore has no property ownership rights, and she also doesn't have the right to own her own children. Her children, under the laws of the slave state in America, her children belonged to whoever owned her. So you can think about all of what that means. That means that slave owners could sell a mother's child down the river to another plantation. And it happened often. That meant that in the case that the child is in danger, as was the case that day with Margaret Garner, she couldn't protect the child. She couldn't keep the child from going back into the horror of slavery. So as you see, Margaret Garner is in a situation, it is what we would call in the study of literature and in the study of tragedy specifically, which is how I read the novel Beloved, it's called the tragic bind or the tragic paradox. But in this case, it's a real one. It's not a fictional story in which we see the character in the tragic paradox again, right? This is real. Margaret Garner is in a situation where in order to do the right thing, which is what the tragic bind means, in order for the figure to do the right thing, they have to do something wrong also. And that's the real kind of soul or core for me of what makes a tragedy, is it the justice or the problem that needs to be solved or the injury that needs to be repaired or the right that needs to be done is not simple. It's complex, and it means also committing a wrong. So think about Margaret Garner's situation. She is in a situation where she has to choose between the life of her child and saving that child from terrible suffering, agony. The first child that you saw, as I said, that she went for was her daughter. That makes sense because daughters, all slaves suffered miserably, but daughters, girls, were what we would call like serially raped. Not all of them, obviously, but many. And that means that because a slave woman did not own her own body, she couldn't protect herself from being raped. And some slave owners, again, not all, but many, used their female slaves, childbearing age. They used them to become pregnant and to give birth to a child that would be another slave, but a slave they didn't have to pay for, the way they had to pay for slaves at the auction block that they would purchase, right? And so this is a way that they would, quote unquote, procure a free slave. There is some evidence, by the way, in the historical archive that this was indeed an experience that Margaret Garner had had, that her mother had had. And so we understand, right? She's trying to save her child. She can't protect her. She can't keep her from enslavement. And so she's in this tragic bind, except that, again, it's a real one. It's not just a story that we're being told. And that's very important. What actually happens to Margaret is that Margaret dies 2 years later. She is she is sent back into slavery. Her husband is, her children are. She dies 2 years later from typhoid fever. Now, Toni Morrison learns of these details and she publishes the story, sort of a short version of the story of Margaret, in a book called A Black Book. And you can get the Black Book. It's, you can, Google it or go on Amazon or whatever. So Margaret's story is included in the book, and Morrison is later takes this story, these sort of bare bones details, because of course, lots of details about slaves were never really archived. We don't have a lot of information about slaves. We don't have near enough information that we should have, because the information wasn't saved in the historical record. Records weren't kept. So that's a tough situation for, Morrison, who wants to now take this story and tell the history of it in the form of a historical novel. So Morrison takes the story, and she basically, the up until the part that I was just telling about the escape, the recapture, the murder of the older child, she basically tells all of that straight, right? Pretty much as it happened, is in the novel. It's told from different perspectives, something like 5 times, but it's told pretty straight. It's after that, so it's after the recapture, and the trial of Margaret that Morrison says kind of no to the history as it happened, and she changes things, and all of those things that she changes are symbolic. A, she keeps Margaret Garner alive. She doesn't let her die. B, she keeps Margaret Garner free and her children. She doesn't let them go back into slavery, and those things are symbolic, right? So she is giving Margaret a future. She's giving her a life. She's giving her own life. And so when the novel opens, it is 18 years later. So now it's 1873. This was all happening around 1855, 56, that's sort of all those events, the trial and everything. Margaret is now in the novel, she's called Seta. The younger daughter who survived that day is called Denver. Her sons are called Howard and Bugler. But Howard and Bugler have left. They no longer live in the house. Oh, and by the way, the house is the safe house. So the safe house that Margaret and Robert arrived to with their kids, and where they were immediately recaptured. That's the safe house that she now lives in Ohio, that was owned by Kite. Now, Seta owns the house. She lives there, and the only other person living there is her younger daughter, Denver. And when the novel opens, Denver and Seta are like doing a seance, like with a Ouija board. They're like holding hands, and we learn right away the house is haunted. There's a ghost. The ghost menaces them pretty frequently and haunts them pretty much all the time. This is why the sons left. They couldn't, they were like, can't keep living in a haunted house, Mom. And they left. And so here we are at the opening of the novel, Denver and Seta trying to call the ghost out. Right? They're trying to have a sort of conversation with the ghost and have a meeting of the minds a little bit. And so the first things we learn, Beloved is a ghost story. And the house that they live in is a haunted house. And we know we are familiar. We may not be familiar with, when I talk about tragedy, what do I mean exactly? We may not be quite so familiar with that, but we know ghost stories, right? We've been hearing ghost stories since we were children. And we understand, right, that the lore of ghosts is what it is. We understand that if there's a ghost, right, that means that there's a problem. When someone dies, we say, rest in peace. And that means don't come back as a ghost. And so if there's a ghost, this means something's wrong. Something happened. Some injustice that we don't know about, something unfinished business. And so the ghost can't rest in peace, the spirit, the dead person, can't rest in peace until whatever that is resolved. So that's the first thing that we learn. Now, why do I say that Beloved is a tragedy? First of all, when I say Beloved is a tragedy, I don't just mean it's tragic, even though it is tragic, but it is also tragedy. And tragedy has for people like me who study literature geeks, tragedy has a very specific meaning. It means a lot of different things. And I want to just do a little bit of a outline of a few of those things which really are quite important in Beloved. First, tragedy is a story about justice. Okay, that's the first thing. There has been some injustice committed, and it isn't just injustice on like a person-to-person level, like two people having a fight because one of them stole something from the other and they've got to get it back or repay them and so on. those things happen too, and we need justice for those things. But a tragedy is justice on a state level, a national level, big injustices that occur, such as the institution of slavery as a massive injustice, right, that occurred in our country. That's the first thing. Second thing, the main character, or like in Beloved, we have four main characters. The main characters in the tragedy, or main character, often it is one person. In this case, as we know, the novel is called Beloved, right? It's called Beloved, and it is named after this character, Beloved, who is the dead daughter. So we know from the title that in a way, although there are four main characters, and we really can't, it's very hard to choose between them, or to say which one is the most important. But we can say a little bit that Beloved is super important because the book is named for her. Just like the play Antigone is named for Antigone, and the play, the trilogy, the Oresteia, is named for Orestes, and the play by Shakespeare, Hamlet, is named for Hamlet, or Othello is named for Othello, right? And we understand because of that that's the figure we're kind of following, Second thing, the tragic figure in a tragedy, or figures, they have to deal with the issue of justice that the play is about, or that the novel is about, right? They have to deal, and that's really their task as a figure, as a character in the story, is that they have to deal with this issue. So they have to bring about justice. They have to figure out, what does justice look like? What do we do? What is to be done? How do we fix this? How do we make this better? This injury that happened, and it isn't small. It isn't simple, it's big, and it's complex, and it's a problem on a national, state, large level. Thirdly, the tragic figure is, as I said before, will find themselves in the tragic mind. From the classical tragedies, which come down to us anyway, in the English literary studies tradition, right? It's the tragedies from classical Greece 2,500 years ago and thereabouts that come down to us, as important to contemporary literature. There are other traditions of tragedy, from around the world, but this is the one that is important mostly in English literary studies. So, and Morrison, by the way, Toni Morrison, who wrote this book, she was a classics minor when she was in college, and she loved the classical era and the classical plays, and there's now some scholarship, which I've been very happy to see, which is about the important role of the classical texts, the texts from 2,500 years ago in Greece, their important role in Morrison's work and all of her novels. So this is good to see. And my book is about that role. Partly it's about that role, the connections between, Antigone from, 2,400 years ago, and Beloved and the other works from that time. So as I was saying before, when Beloved opens, we are in a situation where we learn those couple of important facts. There's a ghost in the house. This means, again, as I said before, if we're going by the lore around ghosts and ghost stories, right, this means that there's something wrong. Beloved actually opens very much the way another tragedy called Hamlet opens. At the opening of Hamlet, and I want to make a little point here, and then I want to sort of tell the trajectory, at least some important pieces of the story that develops in Beloved. But in Hamlet, similar to the opening of Beloved, the first thing we learn is that it's a ghost story and that there's a ghost. And that, again, this means someone's not resting in peace. There's some unfinished business, right? So when Hamlet opens, we see that so Hamlet is a college student, like many of you. He was away at college in Germany. He is from Denmark and lives in Denmark. And his family is the monarchy in Denmark. They are the state in charge of the nation. And while Hamlet is away at college, he learns that his father has died. And of course they think, that he just died, a kind of normal death. And so Hamlet comes home for the funeral. And so he stays, and he's now, grieving. Hamlet is called, the Dark Prince. And that is because he grieves, the loss of his much beloved father. So he's been home for a while. And on a certain night, there have been soldiers kind of guarding the castle for some time now. And that is because they're concerned, with good reason, that there's going to be an attack on Denmark by the nation or country of Norway. And so they have soldiers on guard sort of 24/7. And when the play opens, it's midnight, the witching hour, right? The scary hour of a ghost story or scary story. So it opens at this time, and the soldiers are there, and they're on guard in front. They're on guard, and what are they looking for? They are waiting for to see the Norwegian army coming at them, right? And this is the whole idea. But they don't get what they're waiting for. They don't get what they expect, right? They get something else, and what they get instead is the coming of the ghost, and they see the ghost of Hamlet's dead father there, and he doesn't speak to them or anything, but they clearly see that it's him, looks like him, dressed like him. So they go and they tell Hamlet, and they say, oh, we just saw your father. And Hamlet is, of course, amazed. And so then Hamlet comes the next night, same time. He comes out with the soldiers to stand in front and to wait. And really what Hamlet does in this moment is something, again, like a seance, as I was explaining about the opening of Beloved. Where he comes out because he's beckoning the ghost to come, and he's calling the ghost out. He goes out and calls the ghost out, and indeed this ghost does come, and he tells Hamlet what happened, what the injustice is that has made it so that he can't rest in peace, as I was saying before. So this is what happens in Hamlet. In Beloved, again, a very kind of similar opening where mom and daughter are, have sort of said, let's call this ghost out and try to talk to them and try to get them to stop bothering us so much, or at least have a conversation. And that's really what this opening sequence in Beloved is a symbol of, or what we would call an allegory for. So they want to bring the ghost out, and they want to say, hey, let's talk, right? The ghost doesn't come. Someone else comes. And instead of, so similar to the watchmen, on guard, they're looking out for the Norwegian army. Instead, they get a ghost, right? Here, they're looking out for the ghost. They want to call the ghost up. But instead, they get Paul D. And Paul D is really the character that kind of sets the story. It's like the jumping off point for the story that's taking place, as I said earlier, in 1873. So Paul comes. Paul is kind of an intuitive guy. In this way, he's a little bit like the way Hamlet is characterized by Shakespeare. He's quite intuitive. He senses things. He knows things through feeling or through his intuition. And he Seta invites him in. Immediately upon entering the house, Paul D senses the ghost. The ghost isn't bothering them right then, but he just senses the presence of the ghost. And he says that, and Seta says, indeed, yeah, we are a haunted house. Then they start to just chat and catch up, and Denver's kind of like on the sideline, kind of looking at this guy and doesn't really know what is this guy about. Denver is, they've been quite isolated, the family, because of what happened. The townswomen and the townsfolk haven't really been open to being their friend, and they don't understand why Seta did what she did, or they haven't been able to understand. So they've been really isolated, and Denver has been quite isolated, and she's not really necessarily happy that suddenly there's a guy here, right? And her mom's attention is diverted from her to him. So now, after a few minutes, of course, here comes the ghost. Plates start flying. It's like there's a hurricane inside the house, and Paul D decides, he's gonna try to deal with this ghost, and he's gonna try to get the ghost to stop menacing the family. And so he kind of yells at the ghost and gets into like a battle of wills with the ghost. And sure enough, it works. He suddenly, the rumbling and the settles down, and then eventually, as Morrison says, it was rock quiet, dead quiet, right? And the ghost is gone. It worked. And so Paul stays, and Seta invites him to, stay with him, and then Seta and Paul start to develop a romance. They start to fall in love a little bit, and again, Denver's really struggling kind of, with what does she think about this man, and is it, is he nice, and she's working through all that stuff. And at a certain point, again, they've been very isolated. And so, part of what's going on then in the story is to kind of bring them out of their isolation and one of the progressions of the story, right? So at a certain point, Paul notices that there's an ad in the paper for like a festival or a circus in town. And again, because it's already Jim Crow, we're now 1873, as I said. The entire contemporary plot takes place in over just like a few months in the year 1873. Because Jim Crow segregation has already been put into effect, this means like the fair, they can only go to the fair at certain times because they're becoming they're a black family, but they're sort of becoming a family right now, right? And so Paul sees this and he says, well, why don't we go and let's have a good time? And they see in the ad, it says, black families can only come at these times. And so they're like, all right, well, we'll go then and we'll have a good time. And they go. They're really starting to kind of, for the first time, feel a little bit together as this new sort of family unit. And then they walk home. And who is there waiting for them but the ghost? She wasn't gone. It was just a tease. She's back. Or she was always there. But now she's really back. And now she just got a lot scarier because now the ghost isn't just an invisible specter in the air of the house. Now she has a body. She is an adult woman. And so when they arrive home, they don't really realize that it's her at first. Like they just think she's a wandering person who was emancipated 8 years ago and is wandering and maybe looking for her family and not finding them. You can imagine for a minute this moment in American history and what that would have meant for the millions of slaves that were emancipated. And you can imagine, just as Paul D had been wandering, for the entire 18 years between when they escaped from the plantation. He was Seta's friend on the plantation. She hasn't seen him for 18 years. In that entire 18 years, which is also Denver's entire lifetime, Paul was wandering. He was homeless and wandering. And what we don't really realize at first with Beloved is that when he arrives, it's like he's arriving home for the first time in his life. And this idea of home really attaches to him as a sort of idea that follows the character of Paul D. So they take this woman in. They think that she's just, again, a wandering homeless woman. She's like 21, the very age the daughter would be if she had lived. Seta doesn't recognize her at all. Seta just thinks that she's a homeless woman, and she feels, of course, we'll take her in and feed her and give her a bed and help her, and they may have done that for other people as well. Who knows, But this is this individual, and what they don't realize is that she was waiting for them, and she is now the resurrection of the ghost. And she is in part the resurrection of the dead daughter. So this is important, right? That now we have this ghost, but the ghost is in a body, and we thought she disappeared. She hasn't disappeared. The story progresses, and two things I just want to mention that happen that are a little bit important to the outcome and to my particular reading of the novel in my book. One, we start to see over time that Beloved is like, she has otherworldly magical powers. And she, like at a certain point, Denver really notices this first. She starts to like levitate. She like lifts off the bed, magically. And she does other magical things. She does other things that are impossible. She also, in terms of my reading of the novel as a tragedy and reading it through that literary history of tragedy. Another thing that's, I think important is that Beloved is not just the resurrected daughter, that is the shape she takes, right? But she is also modeled on what are called the Greek Furies, which you may or may not have heard of. They're really called the Greek Erinyes, Erinyes. But the Erinyes were part of Greek mythology and part of the tragedies, and they were a band of females that were like arbiters of justice, and just sort of like the Powerpuff Girls. And they had two types of individual that they went after. They went after blood criminals, which means someone who kills a member of their family. their same bloodline, and that's Seta, obviously, because she has murdered her older daughter. They also go after breakers of oaths, important cultural value, Greek cultural value. So this idea of a Greek Aranese or Greek fury, fury is the word used in the Roman tradition, is that she isn't there to be all warm and fuzzy and lovey-dovey with mom. That's not her purpose. This visitation is not about that. The Furies were pretty vicious. They're also called the Raging Ones. They rage. They're also called the Wraths, meaning that they are wrathful, vengeful, furious, spiteful. They are there to enact revenge. They are there to destroy the blood criminal or oath breaker. So Beloved is not there, for a love fest or homecoming. She is there to destroy Seta. And indeed, she almost does destroy Seta. She starts to drive her mad, which is what the Furies do. Unfortunately, the Furies are like the embodiment in Greek mythology of like female power. And of course, therefore, because all of our societies are patriarchies, right? Then that idea of female power, they're made to look, they're always pictured in Greek mythology as, hideous looking and horrible and scary. They're chthonic, meaning they come from the underworld, and they're scary. You don't want the Furies after you. In other words, the Furies have like snakes for hair, whereas like Beloved is described at a certain point in the novel as having fish for hair, sort of like the snakes, but fish. So they're quite awful, and scary and menacing and stuff. And I would prefer that the Furies were depicted more like the Powerpuff Girls, right? That they were not depicted as such evil, awful, scary, vicious, frothing, evil beings, but that is the depiction. And it's symbolic too, right? In a patriarchy where women aren't supposed to have power, right? And of course, that's part of what this is about. So Morrison is sort of taking this tradition, and Morrison, being a great feminist, everything she wrote qualifies as under the category of feminism. She's kind of taking this on, but taking it on in an interesting and a kind of new way. Anyhow, Beloved is a Fury. She is furious. She is spiteful. She is jealous, for example, of the love that has grown between Seta and Paul. She's an absurd figure. She's like still kind of a baby in the sense that she can't hold her head up. How babies do this, and she can't hold her head up. She can't really talk. Almost like a 2-year-old, or whatever. She speaks in poetic fragments, mostly when she talks. She doesn't really know her name. She when they ask her what her name is, she just says the word beloved. But the word beloved is the word that was on her gravestone. That's like, it's as if when she resurrected, this is the word or the thing that she brings back with her, is this word beloved. And of course, that's deeply symbolic on many levels, that's the word, that attaches to her, that is her moniker. She's an absurd figure, and also a figure with magical powers. So she's powerful and absurd. And at a certain point, because she's jealous and she wants, she may be babyish, but she's also an adult woman, and she wants Paul G. She wants that intimacy with him. She wants his love and his affection, which is going to Seta because he's falling in love with Seta. So she uses her magical powers. There's a chapter that begins, she moved him. And Morrison, in this case, means literally moved him from one location to another. So Paul wakes up, he went to bed, he sleeps in the same bed with Seta. They're becoming a couple, they've become a couple. And then he wakes up the next morning and he's in a chair in the living room. Or he wakes up the next morning and he's in the other bedroom or something. And he doesn't know how he got there or what happened. And sure enough, he just keeps getting moved out of his closeness with Seta. At a certain point, she dramatically moves him out to the shed behind the house. And this is really quite symbolic because the shed is where Beloved died. It's where the child died. And so she moves him out there and basically, uses her magical powers to rape Paul D. She wants to become pregnant, and and she uses him to do that. So, beloved is not there for good reason, and as we see across the novel, this happening. So Paul D does eventually leave Seta. He doesn't leave Seta because of beloved necessarily, but he leaves Seta because another character told him that she murdered her older daughter, and he didn't know that. They hadn't talked about it yet, and he can't understand. He's upset. He feels embarrassed for Seta. He feels like she did a terrible wrong thing, and he leaves her. So that's kind of a beginning, sort of a beginning of the decline. Shortly after that, there's another part of tragedy called recognition and reversal, and we see this as well. Shortly after that, Seta and Denver and Beloved go out one day to ice skate. It's winter. They come home. It's very cold. They build a fire, and they drink warm milk. And all of a sudden, Beloved starts singing a song. She starts humming a song, and the song is Seta's song. The song is a song that Seta made up, and it was a song that she sang to her children when she put them to bed at night. There's Beloved humming this song, and now, for the first time, suddenly Seta recognizes this is her resurrected daughter. Until then, she doesn't recognize her at all. She just thinks she's a stranger. And so there's this big moment of recognition, which is an important moment always in these stories, and then come following the recognition. So the recognition is like something that the reader of the book or the audience in the theater knows, but the character doesn't know. And so part of the tension in the story is, when will they recognize this truth that is, and when will they see it? And then there's this big dramatic moment, often of recognition. But the recognition in tragedy, at least often, is followed swiftly by reversal or decline. So there is this recognition, and then Seta is like we are right now with this virus, right? Seta's distracted. She's, emotional. She doesn't quite know how to respond. She's, for the first time in her life, in 18 years of having a job, she's late a couple times for work. And of course, there's no mercy. She gets fired. Boom. So now here begins. We see a swift decline. Seta loses her job, therefore loses her income. Therefore, how's she going to buy food, other than the food they grow, other than the couple chickens they have in a coop in the yard? How are they going to eat? And so her decline begins. Her decline is exacerbated by the fury Beloved. Beloved starts to drive her mad, just as the Furies do. Beloved becomes all-consuming for her. Beloved is constantly asking for things and constantly sort of obsessively needing her mother, and this is one of the ways that she is destroying her. The other daughter, Denver, who, as I said before, has been isolated across her 18 years of life, realizes this is happening. And in this moment, Denver really becomes kind of the epic hero of this story. Not necessarily a tragic hero, but an epic hero. And, and it's sometimes people think that, right, epic and tragedy are mutually exclusive. That if a tragedy is a tragedy, it's not also an epic. In this case, in the hands of a storyteller like Morrison, a literary genius that such as she possessed, it is both. And Denver is the epic figure in this story. She is the epic hero. And so she realizes she's got to get out of the house. She's got to get out into the town. She has to find people. She has to find help because her mother's being destroyed. And she doesn't know what else to do. And so she gets out. She starts making connections. She starts building sustainability in a way for the family. And sure enough, the townswomen respond in kind. They start sending parcels magically. Baskets start appearing on the porch in front of the house, food and eggs and milk and things like that. And then at a certain time, the townswomen get together and they sort of say, this situation isn't cool. Like, and they kind of start thinking through again. And this is what I mean when I say, like, one of the great things about tragedy is that it's a kind of story that makes us really have to think through complex ethical questions. and that's one of the reasons I study tragedy. I think it's really valuable as a type of story. So the townswomen now are like thinking this through again, and they're realizing maybe we were a little hard on her, and maybe we can ought to do something because to help the family survive this crisis. So they go to the house on one day at the same time. They all go to the house and they come to basically offer an outpouring of love to the family, to Seta. So they sing songs, they pray out loud. They're almost like a Greek chorus or a gospel choir. In front of the house, they keen and wail and stuff. And it works. 1 second, there's Beloved, big pregnant on the porch. The family's there on the porch, and all of a sudden, poof, Beloved disappears. She doesn't run down the stairs and into the woods. She literally disappears from the porch. And now she's gone. And we, as readers of the story, we're very relieved at this point. We're like, oh, whew, the antagonist is defeated. Now Seta can live, and we're happy, and we feel our happy ending coming. And then that feeling is really ratcheted up when, right after this happens, Paul D comes back. Paul D, just like the townswomen, and just like us as readers of the story, learning about slavery, learning about Margaret Garner, learning about what the wretchedness that slavery actually was, right? Which we haven't had many opportunities as Americans to learn about. Paul D has had time to reflect and realizes that he does love Seta, and he actually does understand. In spite of himself, he actually does understand what happened. He gets it. And he goes back and kind of apologizes and professes his love to Seta, and they have this beautiful, beautiful romantic reconciliation. Again, the trope of reconciliation, right? Truth and reconciliation, and the importance of that in this story and in tragedy in general, but in this story for sure. It's where we start. And they try to reconcile initially with the ghost, and it's where we end with Paul D coming back and reconciling with Seta. So we feel like that's our happy ending, yay, and we feel good. And then we turn the page and we see that there are 2 pages remaining. And we just think, well, it's just going to be the end of the story. And, no. This is Toni Morrison. She's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant storyteller. And what we realize in the very last 2 pages of the story is, no, Beloved's not gone. She brings Beloved back. She says we still see Beloved's footprints back and forth at the banks of the river. We see other signs of Beloved in the air, in houses with people, and so we are then like brought to this sober, contemplative space on these last 2 pages of like, wow, okay, the ghost is still here. What does that mean, right? Why did she do that? That means that both exorcisms were teases. Paul D didn't get rid of the ghost. The townswomen didn't get rid of the ghost. She's still here. So let's think for a minute about what that means, right? What this book is trying to get us to think through. And that is that the story is representing America. It's representing the history of slavery. It's representing us, our American nation. And if the house is haunted, well, a house in a story is very often a symbol of the nation. It's a symbol, right? A house houses a family. A nation is a nation family, right? We, America, we are one nation. We are diverse, right? And that's what's great about us, right? Our diversity is our strength. But we're one nation in and with our diversity. And what Beloved is teaching us is that we are a haunted nation. We are haunted. We continue to be haunted. If Beloved is still there haunting the nation at the very, very, very last word of the book, at the very end of the book, well, what is the beyond of the book? The beyond of the book is always now. You finished the book, you are then in the beyond of the book after Beloved, right? After reading Beloved. And that's then always now. And that means that Beloved is still haunting now, right? So what Morrison is saying is we are a haunted nation. One of the things in Hamlet right, that I started to suggest earlier is that the when the ghost is discovered in Hamlet, one of the soldiers sort of reflects for a minute. Again, reflection being such an important part of tragedy. The character who reflects and he says, "Oh, if there's a ghost here, that something's wrong, right?" As I said before, and he says something is rotten in this state, and the thing, right, that is rotten in the state is the terrible injustice that happened to Hamlet's father. Which the ghost needs to tell Hamlet because Hamlet doesn't know what it is. No one knows except the person who did it. Whose name is Claudius. In America, in Beloved, with regard to her haunting, we know exactly what it is. We don't need the ghost to tell us, right? What the rottenness is that lives at the heart of who we are, even as great as we are, right? As a people, as a nation, and all the amazing. There is also this rottenness that lives at the heart of us, and until that rottenness is addressed, healed, fixed, repaired, until justice is found, we will continue to be haunted. And this is the point of the novel Beloved by Toni Morrison. That means that the novel is about reparations, and the ghost called, not named Beloved, is the specter of reparations. And that's one of the key things that my argument in my book is founded upon. The theme for Women's History Month this year is nevertheless she persisted. And it is the perfect theme for what I'm saying to you now. I'm going to end soon because I'm just over an hour. It is the perfect theme for my book and for the book Beloved by Morrison, because the point really in the end is that she persists. Beloved persists despite multiple exorcisms, despite the teases, which is again the work of a great storyteller, right? That we think something's happened and then we turn the page and aha, so it hits us, right? And then we have to say, wait, what? Beloved's still here? What's going on? Why didn't she disappear? Why didn't... Right? She is the specter of reparations. We have never had reparations for slavery in America. And that's Morrison's point, is that until we heal that, right, until we have truth and reconciliation and an official national working through, if you will, of that history, then the cycles of racist hatred that keep forming into what we could call a hegemony, that keep forming into like power centers in our midst, and that come to define us, right? So we can think about, history. If we just kind of stand back from American history and take like a long view, we see the cyclical nature of what I'm calling a racist hegemony. Hegemony just means something that becomes powerful and affects people, lots of people, and comes to define a nation, a society, comes to be the way things are there. And so we see this racist, powerful things, right? Powerful racist things that keep, begin, are ended, come back, are ended, come back again. And those cycles we can say, and you can Google all of this, and I don't have time because I don't want to belabor this video much longer. But cycle number one, slavery. For those of you who think that slavery also impacted white people, wrong. White people were definitely indentured servants. They were definitely forced into labor contracts, and that was not a good place to be at all. Many indentured servants were treated awfully, but it wasn't slavery, and that's really important. In fact, the laws governing the slave state were very specific about this. They specifically said a chattel slave is a person of African descent. A chattel slave, they would use the word colored, right, is a colored only. The laws were really clear that slavery only applied to people of African descent or partially African descent. So slavery. Then slavery is abolished. Yay! Then, coming right after the abolition of slavery, we have what I mentioned before, Jim Crow segregation. Google it. Along with that, we have this era of lynching, awful, hateful awfulness. Along with that, we have rampant discrimination, because now the slaves have been emancipated. They're free persons, citizens like every other citizen now. Rampant discrimination and no laws to protect them from this. Rampant discrimination, all the things that come up to equal the American dream. Housing, education, employment, lending, voting. Okay, all the things that equal sort of, sustainable life, rights, democratic rights, civil rights are denied black people just across the country. Many black people in what's called the Great Migration, they sort of leave the South. They kind of, at this point, they like kind of exit the South almost, thinking that when they get to the North, when they get to Chicago, which is where Native Son is set, when they get to Philadelphia, when they get to New York City, they think that they're going to find a better place and a freer place, and a place where there's less racism. And of course, guess what? What do they find north? Not all that different from what they found in the South. People sort of think, oh, it's, the racist people are all sort of down there in the South. No. And so we have this moment of all this new awfulness, this new racist hegemony that comes into effect following emancipation. Then we have the civil rights, right? Again, Google it. 1964 sweeping legislation, a big wave of love crashing in and canceling out, this earlier awfulness, right? And doing away with the racist hegemony of the earlier times, and wonderful. Then cycle number 3, and this is the cycle that we live in now. It is our moment. It is our civil rights crisis. And that is what we call mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is, there are other problems too, but mass incarceration is probably the biggest and the worst and the most awful, because mass incarceration in a certain way is the reinvention of Jim Crow segregation, as argued by Michelle Alexander in her book. It is, for me, it is the reinvention of slavery. It is a reinvention of the slave state, and I'll explain that quickly now. So mass incarceration is a program that came about following civil rights. So it's like during the civil rights moment, like all these laws are passed, and now people can't just be blatantly racist anymore, because it's against the law. So to be racist, and then there are 11 other, protected classes under the Civil Rights Act, and one of them is race, women, people on welfare, people who are immigrants, right? So there are 12 total protected classes under civil rights. Now the racism starts to get reshaped in like cloaked, sneaky forms, because now again there are these laws, and so they can't just deny someone a job because they're black anymore, or they can't just keep someone from voting because they're black like they used to do. So now is what we call the Southern Strategy, and it's the Southern Strategy and a whole bunch of other like programs, processes, paradigms that come into existence that all come together to add up to mass incarceration. And when I say that, what I mean is that in the history of America up until 1978, which is kind of the starting point of where we start to see mass incarceration started, around 1978, right after civil rights. So in the history of the United States, a whole history, there was only ever like 300,000, 325, 350,000 people in prisons across the country from coast to coast. Now, in this year, at this time, our lifetime, there are between 2.3 and 2.4 million people in prison. American citizens in prison today. There's a whole bunch more now on our southern border who are living in terrible conditions of incarceration. So how do we account for this? How do we explain this huge increase? 2 million more people in prison. So some people might say, well, crime rates must have skyrocketed. That's why. No, crime rates dropped during this time. Then you might think, so maybe there was a population explosion. So there's a lot more people, so there's more criminals. Nope. Not that either. There wasn't a population explosion. There wasn't an explosion in crime. Neither of those things explains. If you're like Donald Trump, you would probably be inclined to blame the immigrants, right? Nope, not that either. What explains the precipitous, dramatic rise in the number of incarcerated people are policies, programs, some laws, some new laws that got put into effect. And so Google this, right? The Southern Strategy. Google, the war on drugs. Google broken windows policing, stop and frisk. You probably don't need to Google that one. And read about these things. And these are the things that all come together. Another factor in all of this is the criminalization of mental health. So, people who used to be, in the past, people who have, like, say, schizophrenia, or they have PTSD, perhaps, and, in the past, they wouldn't be put in prison. Now they're put in prison. So there's a lot of people in prison who really, they need health care. They don't need prison, right? They need to be taken care of in terms of their mental health. Anyway, you can read this book. It was also just made into a movie, but the movie was really just a small fragment of the book. And this is a really important Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. He's a brilliant attorney who lives in Alabama, and he's doing really important work. And read that book, Just Mercy. It's totally readable, and I highly recommend it if you want to learn more about what do I mean when I say mass incarceration. So this is our moment, this moment when we have all these imprisoned individuals. And why is it important? Why do I dwell on it a little bit, even though I'm over time? So I'll be done in 2 minutes. I dwell on it because in America, there's two things. When you are imprisoned, number one, you lose your civil rights. You lose the right to vote. And then you effectively lose other important civil rights. That's one thing. We just had the civil rights movement. Boom. Now we have mass incarceration and the Southern Strategy. And now millions, 2 million people, right, more than we'd ever had in prison before, have lost those rights. So it's like a rollback of civil rights. An undoing of the Civil Rights Act is really, in a way, what mass incarceration actually is. The other thing is, in our Constitution, still, it is true that if you are imprisoned, if you are deemed a criminal, whether you are or not really, but if you have a criminal record, then you can be enslaved. It's in our Constitution. This is something obviously we need to work on and fix, because no one should be enslavable under any circumstances, right? If you are a criminal, you commit a crime, you do whatever sentence you're given, you pay your debt back to society, but that doesn't mean you lose your person status. It should not mean that you lose your person status. It should not mean that you can be enslaved, right? I think we can all pretty much agree on that. So this is the problem, and this is really the civil rights crisis of our time. So right now we have a big crisis facing us, right, which is this virus, and we're all distracted by it, and rightly so. And but the work goes on, right? As I said, I was thinking earlier, that part of the reason I wanted to make this video was to sort of say, like, the show must go on. We, even in a time like this, we continue doing what we always do to the extent possible and safely. So I wanted to make this video again so that we have something, still we're moving forward, still we're doing what we do. I'm having my classes at our class time, on our class days with my students, because I think it's important that we keep those structures in place and we continue to feel like we can do the things we normally do. We just have to do them now in new and different ways, and moving things online as I moved my talk online, right, on this video. So Morrison's novel is saying that until we have reparations, until we have truth and reconciliation, until we deal with this cyclical hatred, this racist hatred is just going to keep cycling. And none of us should be okay with that. No matter who we are, whether it affects us or doesn't affect us, none of us should be okay with that, because we are one nation, right? We are one people. And so it's important that we all care about, like, what's happening on our southern border right now. It's important that we all care about, the expressions, for example, of anti-Semitism that we've been seeing. It's important too, and that's really the focus of this talk I've just given, that we care about the conditions of life for African American people, that we know about mass incarceration, that we know the effects of it, and that we work together as one people to end this suffering and end this, this recalcitrant cycle of racist hegemonies that keep forming, right? This is what that sentence is about in Hamlet. There's something rotten, and we need to deal with the rottenness, and the rottenness is racism. It's defined us from the beginning. It's defined us from before the beginning. It's slavery that built the colonies and, turned them into thriving. It's slavery that built this nation, built the White House. Slaves built the White House, in fact. So we need to work together, and we need to get to a point of reparations. This is something we need to embrace as a people. And while it is true, we know that it's true too, that poor people of all backgrounds suffer. And that's true. But poor white people suffer. Poor white people have been impacted by mass incarceration. And we need to talk about those things too. People of all backgrounds, especially who are poor, suffer in this country. And that's not okay for anyone, right? But I think it's also okay for us to really say, but this is a center of culture in America. This is one of the centers of us, this racism that just keeps coming back and coming back. And we all need to get together, hold hands like Seta and Denver are doing at the beginning of the novel, right? And say to ourselves, how are we going to get past this finally? So let's do that, right? And for now, let's stay safe. Use our hand sanitizer, keep our social distance, but also let's keep doing the things we normally do to the extent we can and safely, right? And so I will see my students online for our classes. I will see you in the streets fighting for social justice, right? I will see you in our work as warriors for love, which is what we need to be in terms of all the issues that I've laid out in this talk. So thanks so much for hanging out with me. And I'm sorry this video got a little longer than it was supposed to, but there we are. But I will also include, if you scroll down, you'll see a bunch of links. And so I'm going to link a bunch of things in the description for the video, so you can just find different stuff that I'm talking about. All right, good. Thank you so much. And Warriors for Love. All right. Bye-bye.